"You never deserved him," my mother-in-law hissed, slapping a stack of papers on the coffee table. "The house is ours now." I stared at the pile of debt notes in front of me, each bearing my late husband's signature. Some paper edges were yellow with age, others crisp and new, all promising sums I'd never heard of. The total at the bottom of the final page, $175,000. My hands trembled as I looked up at Elizabeth's stone-cold face, her diamond earrings catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows of what I thought was my home. Just 7 days after we buried David. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice breaking. My 2 children, ages 4 and 6, colored quietly in the corner, oblivious to the fact that their world was crumbling around them. David never mentioned any loans. "Of course he didn't," Patricia, my sister-in-law, chimed in from her perch on the arm of my sofa. "He knew you'd be useless about it. Always were with money." I clutched the wooden photo frame David had given me last Christmas, my fingers tracing where he'd carved our initials into the corner. Inside was a picture of our family, the 4 of us at the lake last summer. David's smile seemed different now, strained around the edges. Had he been carrying this burden then? The same weekend he'd stayed up late, making work calls that left him tense and distant the next morning. The digital clock on the mantel blinked 3:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, the kids had their first grief counseling session, and here I was, learning that the roof over their heads was apparently built on lies. The Minnesota winter was closing in, our first without him, and I couldn't imagine telling Emma and Aiden we might lose the home where their heights were marked on the kitchen doorframe. "I thought we told each other everything," I said to the empty side of the bed that night, running my fingers over David's pillow. The first month without him had been a fog of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and explaining to Emma and Aiden why Daddy wasn't coming home. Now this. I'd married David Murphy 10 years ago, thinking he was an open book. He'd worked as a software sales manager. I was a part-time bookkeeper who'd scaled back after our first child. Our finances weren't extravagant, but they were stable, or so I'd believed. Looking back, the signs were there. How he'd come home late sometimes, saying he'd been sorting things out with Dad, but never meeting my eyes. The hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Last Thanksgiving, when Robert had made that strange comment about family debts, and David had quickly changed the subject. What kind of wife misses these things? What kind of bookkeeper fails to see financial trouble brewing in her own home? I scrolled through our joint account on my phone for the 1,000th time. Nothing unusual. Just regular bills, grocery runs, the children's activities. Where had $175,000 in debt come from? And why to his parents, of all people? My phone buzzed with a text from Nancy, my closest friend. "Did you tell them you need time to process?" "I still can't believe they ambushed you like that." Asterisk, I typed back. Asterisk, she says they've been patient long enough. Wants me to list the house for sale by end of month. Asterisk, Nancy replied instantly. Asterisk, that's insane. Those loans could be fake. David would have told you. Asterisk, would he though? The thought crept in like a cold draft. David had always handled the larger financial decisions. I managed our household budget, but he took care of investments, insurance, the mortgage. He'd said it was to not burden me, but now I wondered if it was to hide things instead. The next message from Nancy hit me like a punch. "You need to talk to a lawyer before you sign anything." The following morning, I dropped the kids at my mother's house. Mom had offered to keep them overnight, sensing I needed space to fall apart without little eyes watching. In the quiet of my car, I allowed myself to sob for exactly 3 minutes by the dashboard clock before pulling myself together and driving to Riverside Community Bank. "Mrs. Murphy, I've pulled all the account information we have," Marcus said, sliding a folder across his desk. "There's your joint checking and savings, the mortgage account, and the children's college funds." I took a deep breath. "Is there anything else? Any private accounts under David's name? Any large withdrawals or transfers to his parents?" Marcus typed for a moment, frowning slightly. Nothing significant that I can see. There was a secondary checking account that was closed about 3 years ago, but the balance was only about $2,000 when it was closed. What about loans? Would you have records if he took out personal loans? We would if they were through us. There's nothing on file except your mortgage. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. If you're concerned about undisclosed debts, you should know that unless you co-signed, you're generally not liable for debts solely in your husband's name. Even if they're family loans? I asked, thinking of Elizabeth's cold eyes. Especially then, Marcus said firmly. Family loans are often legally unenforceable without proper documentation. Do you have copies of these loan agreements? I shook my head. Just what they showed me yesterday. Nothing notarized, just papers with his signature. Marcus leaned forward. Mrs. Murphy, I don't typically give this kind of advice, but you might want to verify those signatures. And definitely consult an attorney. A flutter of doubt twisted in my stomach. What if David really didn't trust me with money matters? What if Elizabeth was right and I'd been too blind or too naive to see what was happening? David had always managed our investments, insurance, the mortgage. What if that wasn't protection but concealment? On my way out, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from Elizabeth and a text message. Patricia and I are coming by at 7 to discuss listing the house. Be ready with all documents. My stomach clenched. The house, our modest 3-bedroom in a quiet Minneapolis suburb, was the only stability my children had left. I'd brought them home from the hospital to that house. Their heights were marked on the kitchen doorframe. David's ashes sat in an urn on the mantel because he'd loved that home so much he wanted to stay there forever. At the county records office, I confirmed what I hoped was true. The house was in both our names. There it was in black and white, both our signatures on every page, both our names on the deed. If Elizabeth wanted it sold, she'd need my cooperation. As I stood on the steps outside, I looked down at my steady hands. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something sharper, determination, maybe, or anger. This house wasn't just property. It was where David had carried me across the threshold, where he'd built the backyard swing set with his own hands, where we'd planted the maple tree when Emma was born. The first snowfall of every year, he'd wake the children early to watch the transformation of our yard into a winter wonderland. I wouldn't let Elizabeth take that from them. Unless there was something else I was missing. By 6 o'clock, I was home, documents spread across the dining table. I'd made one more stop at Nancy's house to borrow her scanner. I'd scanned each of the loan agreements Elizabeth had left, studying them alongside documents I knew contained David's real signature. Something wasn't adding up. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 p.m. I took a deep breath, smoothed my shirt, and opened the door to find Elizabeth and Patricia standing on my porch, both dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a visit to their grieving daughter-in-law. Catherine, Elizabeth nodded curtly. I trust you've had time to process things. We'll need to move quickly on the house listing. I stepped aside to let them in, noticing how they immediately surveyed the living room as if taking inventory of what they might claim. Would either of you like coffee? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. We're not here for socializing, Patricia said, setting her designer purse on my couch. Mom has the realtor paperwork. I remained standing as they sat, Elizabeth pulling documents from her leather portfolio. I've taken the liberty of contacting Brighton Realty. Jason there thinks we can list at $425,000, which should cover most of what David owed us. Most? I echoed. Elizabeth fixed me with a cold stare. Interest has been accumulating, Catherine. David understood that. When exactly did David take out these loans? I asked, moving to the dining room table where I'd arranged my own documents. Over years, Elizabeth said dismissively. College, wedding expenses, help with the down payment on this house. He was always responsible about acknowledging his debts to family. I pulled out one of the loan documents she'd left. This one's for $30,000, dated just last year. What was that for? Elizabeth and Patricia exchanged glances. Business investment, Patricia said quickly. Dad offered him an opportunity. Strange, I said, since David mentioned nothing about any business ventures with your father. And I notice Robert isn't here tonight. Dad's health doesn't allow for these discussions, Elizabeth replied sharply. Now, if we could move on to the listing agreement, I've been comparing signatures, I interrupted, laying out several documents side by side. These on our mortgage and life insurance from 2 years ago. These on your loan documents from supposedly the same time period. I watched their faces carefully. Patricia's eyes darted to her mother, whose expression remained impassive. What exactly are you implying? Elizabeth asked, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm not implying anything. I'm saying there are inconsistencies. David's signature on our legal documents has a distinctive loop on the D. The signatures on several of these loans are missing that detail. Patricia stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You're not a handwriting expert. No, I agreed, but I'm sure a court would appoint one if necessary. I've been married to David for 10 years. I know his signature better than anyone. Elizabeth's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. We're not discussing this any further without our attorney present. Robert and I lent significant sums to support your lifestyle. The fact that David kept this from you shows how little he truly trusted you with financial matters. The barb struck deep, but I kept my face neutral. If David did borrow money, I'm happy to work out a reasonable repayment plan. But I'll need proof the loans were legitimate, and I'm not selling this house out from under my children while they're still grieving their father. You ungrateful, Patricia began, but Elizabeth cut her off with a raised hand. We've been more than patient, Elizabeth said, gathering her papers. David always said you were difficult about money, but we respected his wishes to handle things delicately. Now that he's gone, we expect what's owed to us. As they stood to leave, Elizabeth paused, her eyes falling on Emma's school portrait on the wall. We're filing for grandparents' rights, by the way. Our attorney believes we have a strong case for partial custody, especially given your financial instability as a single mother. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Get out, I whispered, then louder. Get out of my house. After they left, I sank to the floor, shaking. They wanted everything, not just David's money, but his children too. Our children. My phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. How did it go? I couldn't even find words to respond. Instead, I called the one person I thought might help, Marcus from the bank. Mrs. Murphy? Is everything all right? His voice was concerned even through the speakerphone. They're threatening to take my children, I said, my voice cracking. Because I won't sell the house to pay these supposed debts. There was a pause before Marcus spoke. I shouldn't be telling you this, but after you left today, I did some checking. Your husband came to see me about 6 months ago. He was concerned about some odd financial behavior from his parents. My heart raced. What kind of behavior? He mentioned his father had been pressing him to sign some documents. He wanted to make sure his accounts were secure and that you and the children would be protected if anything happened to him. Did he say anything specific about loans? Marcus hesitated. He mentioned that his father had a gambling problem, that his mother covered it up for years. The pieces suddenly shifted, forming a different picture. Elizabeth's expensive clothes and jewelry. Their frequent cruises that David never seemed excited about. Robert's mysterious health issues that no one would discuss in detail. Mrs. Murphy, Marcus continued, I'd strongly recommend you contact an attorney immediately. And don't sign anything. When I finally texted Nancy back, my plan was forming. They're after the kids now. Going to fight back. Need your help with something. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. I hired Josephine Chin, a family law attorney who specialized in probate and custody disputes. I returned to full-time work at the accounting firm where I'd kept my certification current even while working part-time. I met with Emma and Aiden's school counselor to document their emotional state and establish consistency in their care. And I investigated. Nancy, who worked in insurance, helped me request a full review of all our policies. I discovered David had increased his life insurance 6 months before his heart attack, a policy that Elizabeth didn't know about, made out solely to me and the children. I obtained our complete banking records for the past 10 years and meticulously traced every major transaction. There were no significant, unexplained withdrawals. David had kept immaculate records. Most importantly, I found a sealed envelope in our safe deposit box addressed to me in David's handwriting, open only if necessary. Inside was a letter that made my hands shake as I read it. Catherine, asterisk if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and my parents have likely come to you with claims of debts. I've suspected for some time that my father has been forging my signature on loan documents to cover gambling debts. My mother enables him while pretending everything is fine. Asterisk, I never borrowed money from them for our house, our wedding, or any other major expense. The only loan that was real was my student loan of $18,000, which I repaid in full 5 years ago. Receipts in the blue folder. Asterisk, I've been gathering evidence, but haven't confronted them to avoid a family explosion. I should have told you, but I wanted to protect you from their manipulation. Asterisk, if anything happens to me, they may try to use these false debts to claim our assets, or even worse, influence our children. Don't let them. Asterisk, I've spoken with Marcus at the bank and attorney James Wilson. Contact info below about my concerns. Asterisk, I love you. I trust you. You're stronger than you know. Asterisk, David. Asterisk, the letter was dated just 2 months before his death. When Elizabeth and Robert Murphy arrived at my house the following Friday, they brought reinforcements, their attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, and Patricia, who carried an iPad I assumed contained property listings. They did not expect to find Josephine Chen sitting at my dining room table, documents neatly arranged before her. Nor did they expect Nancy, who had taken the afternoon off to support me. What is this? Elizabeth demanded, eyeing Josephine. Please sit down, I said calmly. This is my attorney, Josephine Chen. We have some matters to discuss. Robert, whom I hadn't seen since the funeral, looked significantly older than his 68 years. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered himself into a chair. Their attorney introduced himself as William Hargrove and immediately tried to take control. We're here to finalize the sale of this property to satisfy outstanding debts owed to the Murphy family. We've been patient, but there are no legitimate debts, Josephine interrupted smoothly, placing a folder on the table. We have evidence that the signatures on your loan documents were forged. Silence fell over the room. Robert's face went ashen. That's a serious accusation, Hargrove said stiffly. Yes, it is, Josephine agreed. We also have David's written testimony regarding his suspicions about these forgeries, documented concerns he shared with financial institutions, and a complete absence of any records showing these supposed loan amounts being transferred to David and Catherine. Elizabeth's perfectly manicured nails dug into the table. This is absurd. We helped them for years. David was always grateful. David left this for me, I said, sliding a copy of his letter across the table. He knew what you were doing. Robert made a strange sound. Something between a gasp and a groan. Patricia stared at her father, confusion washing over her face. Dad, she questioned. What is she talking about? Elizabeth's hand clamped over her husband's arm. Don't say a word, Robert. This is a blatant attempt to avoid family obligations. Josephine calmly laid out more documents. We have compiled evidence suggesting a pattern of financial fraud, possibly connected to gambling debts. We are prepared to take this evidence to the county prosecutor's office. You wouldn't dare, Elizabeth hissed, looking directly at me. We're family. You threatened to take my children, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. You came into my home days after your son's funeral and demanded I sell the roof over their heads. What kind of family does that? Robert suddenly sagged in his chair, his face crumpling. Liz, we have to stop. It's over. Robert, be quiet. Elizabeth snapped, but the dam had broken. I never meant for it to go this far, he mumbled. It was just supposed to be temporary, to cover the Atlantic City losses. But then there was Vegas and the online poker. He looked up at me with watery eyes. David found out last year. He confronted me, said he'd help me get treatment if I came clean to everyone. I was going to, but then. His voice broke. Then we lost him. The room fell silent again, broken only by Elizabeth's harsh breathing and the soft sound of Nancy placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. Mr. and Mrs. Murphy, Josephine said firmly, we have no desire to pursue criminal charges against you. However, my client requires several things: a signed admission that these debts were fabricated, a legally binding agreement to cease all claims against this property and Mrs. Murphy's assets, and the withdrawal of any threats regarding grandparent visitation rights. Elizabeth stood so abruptly her chair tipped backward. This is blackmail. No, I said quietly. It's mercy. David would want his father to get help, not go to prison. He'd want his mother to stop enabling destructive behavior. And he'd want his children to know their grandparents, but only if they can be honest and supportive. Patricia looked shell-shocked, her gaze darting between her parents. Mom? Did you know about Dad's gambling? Is that why we were always lending money to everyone? Elizabeth's perfectly composed facade began to crack. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Their attorney, looking increasingly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Mrs. Murphy, perhaps we should take some time to review these documents privately with our clients. Of course, Josephine replied. We're prepared to give you 48 hours to respond to our proposed agreement. After that, we'll have no choice but to pursue all legal remedies available. As they filed out of my house, Robert paused beside me. Catherine, he began. Don't, I said quietly. Not today. Get help first. Then we'll talk about what kind of relationship you can have with Emma and Aiden. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding for weeks. You did it, Nancy whispered, squeezing my shoulder. David would be so proud. Later that night, after a celebratory dinner with Nancy and Josephine, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the framed photo from my nightstand. David smiled back at me, his arm around my waist, lakeside breeze ruffling his hair. You were right, I told him. I was stronger than I knew. I thought about all the things we don't see about the people we love, not because they hide them deliberately, but because we assume we already know everything important. David had been trying to protect his parents, then me, then finally decided to stand up for what was right. He'd run out of time, but he'd given me everything I needed to finish what he started. The house would remain ours. The children would grow up in a home filled with honest memories of their father. And I discovered something I hadn't expected, my own voice. I transferred David's ashes from the formal urn on the mantel to the simple wooden box he'd actually preferred, the one Elizabeth had called too plain for her son. From the kitchen window, I could see the maple tree in our backyard beginning to turn golden against the darkening Minnesota sky. Tomorrow, the children and I would take his ashes to the lake house we'd rented each summer, where David had carved our initials into the dock, where he'd taught Aiden to fish and Emma to swim, where he'd been happiest. I ran my fingers over the markings on the kitchen doorframe, the growing heights of our children, marked in David's careful handwriting. Some debts can never be repaid. But the ones that matter most aren't measured in dollars. The ones that matter are measured in truth. Would you have confronted the in-laws immediately, or was I right to gather evidence first? What would you have done in my position when faced with losing your home right after losing your spouse,